Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I'm really honored to have been invited, and I want to say thank you very much to the Center for Faith and Inquiry and Professor Tal Howard in particular for having extended the invitation. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here, especially in this rather interesting weather that we've been experiencing here of late. So a couple of weeks after my husband and I moved from South Africa to New Hampshire, and that was in September of 2013, I visited one of the local gyms on my day off, and the very nice white man who was giving me a tour asked me where I was from. I responded, South Africa. Oh, which part of Africa are you from? I thought I just said, but that was just the comment in my head, because my parents raised me very well, I'm glad to say, and so I knew that that was not the appropriate response to utter out loud. So instead, I simply said, Cape Town. There was a brief pause. Oh, so how long you been here? He asked. I just moved here, but I've visited numerous times before. Oh, because your English is flawless. Like, you've got no accent at all. Again, my internal response was, But again, politely, I answered, yeah, well, we speak a lot of English in South Africa. It's our main official language. He quickly interjected, yeah, I know. I mean, I've been to Africa. The East Coast, though, you know. But your English is perfect. I detect no accent. At this point, I was desperate to say, what is this place, Africa, to which you keep referring? I also wanted to ask, and what does no accent mean around here? Do you not realize that even you have an accent? Wow. Instead, I observed a polite silence, and he probably sensed that I was a little perplexed or uneasy, so he moved the conversation back to the gym itself. A few minutes later, as I was leaving, he told me how the platinum membership was better because it includes free classes and the tanning spa. I had to laugh out loud. I won't be needing the tanning spa. His colleague at the front desk laughed with me, but my poor guide was a little startled and started fumbling to say, I know, I just mean, I quickly interjected to put him at ease, I'm just kidding, I'm just messing with you. That was my welcome to New Hampshire. So why do I tell you this ridiculous story? Oh, and by the way, just in case you're wondering, oh, I'm sorry. I am being told to take my earring off because it's making noise. Sorry about that. So just in case you're wondering, I didn't join the gym. The tanning spa just didn't actually add value for me. So, but to be serious, so why do I tell you this ridiculous story? Because apparently a lot of people don't realize that Africa is in fact a continent as opposed to a country. And a lot of people don't know that South Africa is a country as opposed to a state, province, or region of the supposed country of Africa. I'm sure none of you are guilty of that terrible mistake, but experience, even in my undergraduate teaching here in the US, has shown me that clarifying this point is, in fact, an important place to start whenever I talk to foreign audiences about South Africa. So please pardon me that out of course of habit, I am going to start by introducing you to this place called South Africa. A related reason why I start with the story is that I actually have to confess that I find the topic that the organizers and I settled on a little bit nerve-wracking. And the reason for that is that as an academic, and I know that many can relate in this space, any broad sweeping statements actually kind of make me a little bit nervous because they sound more like sound bites on the news than like rigorous and nuanced scholarship. So in my mind, a title like the one we agreed upon for my talk is as good, and I mean read bad, as a newspaper headline. I suppose it comes out of the fact that as an African, Ever conscious of how Africa is forever described in very reductionist terms, as though it has only one story to tell, I'm convinced that anyone who purports to be able to tell you about women in post-apartheid South Africa in 45 minutes is obviously not to be trusted. So, I would say you should be skeptical. After all, given the diversity of women's experiences, even in a single community in South Africa, where would one even start? So I'm going to try to protect myself from the risk of being called a charlatan, take out an insurance policy, if you will, by framing this conversation in terms of the fact that I could not possibly tell you about women in post-apartheid South Africa in this time, and just how incredibly dangerous it would be for you to walk away thinking that I had. So, the best expression I've ever heard of why this is so is in the following clip that I'd like to share with you. And I've heard, actually, that some of you have maybe even seen this clip, so hopefully it doesn't feel too repetitive to you.
So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals.
You get the point. I still encourage you to watch the rest of the talk if you haven't actually. And in fact, if you've never read any of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's work, I encourage you to track some down because immersing herself in her literature, reading the stories that she writes, is in fact truly a treat. Nevertheless, back to my story. And I guess, as I said, I wanted to open by making sure that I took out this insurance policy and say that what I'm about to tell you, which actually are some very bold statements about South Africa, is only a single story. And I hope that it will not become the definitive single story that you have of South Africa. So, this is South Africa. Oh, there we go. And I'm going to tell you about a small sliver of it, about 46% of South Africa's population of 53 million, in fact, a sliver that lives in rural areas under indigenous law, 57% of whom are women. It's a very poor sliver. Most of the areas that I study have a poverty rate of about 72% or more. Those are the brown areas that you see in the map. And these images that I'm about to scroll through will give you a sense of what these places are like, if only a very small sense. Starting with Keiskammahoek in the Eastern Cape, southeastern corner of South Africa. moving to Mbuzini, which is in Mpumalanga in the northeastern corner of South Africa. You see how relatively poor and yet somewhat diverse it is. And then Msinga in the eastern corner of, in the eastern part of South Africa in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, the place in which I've been working the most recently. So, how to summarize the experience of women in South Africa? I keep returning to two central ideas. Firstly, that you cannot think about South Africa and the situation of women there today outside of the historical context out of which their circumstances arise. And secondly, that you cannot talk about the women without talking about their men and their experiences, because men are in fact a crucial part of the picture that makes up women's lives. So I'll begin with the first, that women's present sets of conditions have women's past situations intricately woven into them. Many of you will be surprised to learn that pre-colonially, South African indigenous cultures were both matriarchal and patriarchal. Conventional wisdom says that most, if not all, African cultures are inherently and historically patriarchal, if not downright misogynistic. This is simply not true. Sure, there were many patriarchal communities, and some of them were indeed somewhat misogynistic. But even those communities that were predominantly patriarchal were simultaneously matriarchal. For instance, in many communities, women's marriages were at least partly arranged by their families because marriage and women's physical and biological productivity was the basis of building social networks and material security for multiple generations. But even then, marriage was typically not something that happened in a single moment, but something that took place by means of a fluid process over a lifetime, thus allowing women a lot of freedom to be more or less bound by their spouses as they saw fit. In some communities, it was even acceptable for women to live with their birth family throughout their marriage, thus allowing them to be more independent while having legitimate children with their husbands. I know that as Christians, we would disagree with marriage as anything but a fixed lifelong commitment, and we'll probably disagree among ourselves about how much authority a man should have over a woman as the head of the household, maybe ranging between views as to whether the emphasis in Ephesians 5 should be submit to one another or wives submit to your husbands. However, the point remains that women had a lot of freedom under pre-colonial custom, and hence the prevailing idea of pre-colonial indigenous communities being oppressive towards women is just not true, but was largely imposed or caused by distortions implanted by colonial authorities. And it was these colonial authorities who actually brought their patriarchal Victorian beliefs on the local indigenous communities, to the local indigenous communities and ultimately imposed them. For instance, government reports from the mid to late 1800s give accounts of British native commissioners horrified at finding that Ndebele women were liberated enough to choose who they desired to marry without restriction, and therefore recommending that new legislation be applied to the Ndebele women as a solution. The legislation applied referred to women and children as inmates in the family home, under the control of and owing obedience to the man as family head. The man was also then given ownership of all family property. As a consequence, women were denied freedom and the right to own property in their own right, on their own. This despite the fact that even in patriarchal indigenous communities, women had been able to own property in their own right under indigenous community systems and laws. In time, during the early 1900s, the government declared Native women, quote unquote, perpetual minors, which actually meant that they had to go from being wholly dependent on their fathers to being wholly dependent on their husbands. What had previously been an arrangement by which women and children were taken care of by the collective, because nuclear families, as they are understood in Western cultures, were unknown at the time, that system became a system of legally imposed and enforced oppression. And whereas women's relative independence had previously given them some power under what had been much more of a system of shared responsibility to protect women and children, they were now strictly bound to obey the men in their lives, knowing that the force of the law was on the men's side. I would be remiss if I left out the fact that pre-colonial marriages had been negotiated by means of gift exchange. In other words, the man's whole family, especially his father, was expected to provide cattle that would be gifted to the bride's family when his son got married. This was called bride wealth. The colonial authorities referred to it as bride price and saw it as immoral because they considered it the sale of women. There isn't sufficient time for explaining the nuances of why they were wrong, to assume based on the faults of their own dowry system that the bride wealth system was oppressive to Indigenous women. The key takeaway is that they tried to dissuade and ban the system. In part, they raised the bride wealth or bride price legally required, the actual amount that was legally required, to an amount that most families just could not afford. The consequence is that the set of interventions actually, instead of persuading or compelling the local South African communities to abandon bride wealth as part of a marriage and marry without it, Indigenous communities actually retained their moral commitment to bride wealth, and yet without the means to pay it, they practically abandoned marriage. And I think that as Christians who are very pro-marriage, it's fair to say that this was a disastrous outcome. But certainly from a sociological perspective, it has been devastating for the financial security of families, the rearing of children, especially boys, who are now commonly raised by just their mothers without their fathers being part of the picture, and the social stability of families, and then, of course, by extension, that of communities. Take, for example, the fact that today, over 2/3 of Black children live in households without both parents. Just below 42% of Black children grow up in single-parent households, mostly raised by their mothers. In the areas where I do research, over 44% of homes are female-headed households. Contrast this with 83% of Indian children and 73% of white children living with both of their parents. With South Africa experiencing an overall official unemployment rate of 25%, women are more likely than men to be without a job. 30% of Black women, as contrasted with 56% of white women, are employed. 42.8% of Black men are employed, while 72.6% of white men are. This gender difference is despite the fact that women make up 51% of the country's population of 53 million, in which Black women represent just over 21.6 million of the 27.15 million women in South Africa. So I've mentioned already that I study rural Indigenous women who are least likely to have completed high school education, typically because the apartheid government did not give them the chance, and South Africa is actually still reeling from the effects thereof. For example, we just don't have enough qualified teachers to meet the needs of our educational system, and so about 80% of our schools have been declared failing schools. These are therefore places in rural areas where the percentage of women over 18 years of age who have only completed primary school and not gone further is an average of about 59%, ranging between 44% in one village and about 80% in another. This is as compared to the national average of Black South African women over the age of 25 of 14%, so 14% of Black women over the age of 25, and less than 1% of white women of the same age are unemployed who actually didn't finish high school. So nationally, unemployment in the decade leading up to 2011 was about 85.8% among Black women who had not completed high school. It scarcely needs to be said then that with those numbers in the background, that it is really tough for particularly Black and especially rural Indigenous women in South Africa. But these numbers also point to the second point that I want to make, namely that it is no walk in the park for women either. The historical background I provided earlier may have left the impression that Black men were substantially beneficiaries of apartheid, but that is not at all true. History shows how difficult apartheid made things for Black men as well. Hence, addressing men's challenges is actually an important part of understanding and addressing South African women's adverse circumstances today. Let me use the patriarchal Zulu-speaking society for illustration. In pre-colonial times, there were multiple masculinities in coexistence among the Zulus. Yet the preferred masculinity was one in terms of which, according to a scholar, Mark Hunter, and in his words, big men accumulated many cattle, took several wives, and thus built a successful homestead. You may be aware that this is a version of Zulu masculinity to which our current president, who is himself Zulu-speaking, has subscribed wholly. But try not to be too distracted by the style of dress and the polygyny, and instead track with me on the masculinity point for a moment. Benedict Carton and Robert Morrell, two scholars who focus on Zulu society in South Africa, make the observation that historically all people, young and old, were expected first to uphold life-affirming, heroic, and householder traditions that preserved domestic security. And so prized masculine values include things like martial prowess with honesty, high morality shown in the absence of premarital penetrative sexual interaction with a female subject, even though intimate encounters were allowed, loyalty, a sense of responsibility, courage, self-control, athleticism, alertness, endurance, and absence of emotion, a complex mix of values. But men, as a consequence of this complex mix of values, did actually invest a lot in setting up successful homesteads. And the ability to achieve this key part of their identity and what it meant to be a man in their society was what the colonial order and apartheid and its architects took away from them. The colonial and apartheid governments set up the migrant labor system that used Black men as cheap labor in mining and agriculture in the developing formal economy. The government instituted taxes, not to use the funds to serve and develop the indigenous communities, but rather as a way of forcing the indigenous men into formal employment, which was the only place where they could actually earn the currency that was required to pay the new government taxes. The proceeds were actually to go into the coffers of the crown, that is England, under colonialism. And of course, Americans know a lot about this because this was part of what actually created the country of America, was resisting that colonial oppression. And under apartheid, the taxes then went to giving white people greater benefits and security. Black men were therefore forced to leave their families for periods of between 6 months and 2 years at a time in order to go to work on the mines and farms where they lived under quite inhuman conditions and thereby shore up the fledgling capitalist economy in South Africa. The key point that I mean to make here is that as far as it concerns women, indigenous masculinity has never been static, but it did change over time as a result of the various influences on it. Specifically in the 1900s, two dynamics occurred almost simultaneously. On one hand, the colonial state co-opted African men into tightening control over women. On the other hand, the changes in the economy and forced migration for labor purposes made it almost impossible for men to realize their values of maintaining a strong household. This, therefore, placed a double bind on men. As Mark Hunter observes, we cannot overstate the extent to which aspiring for manhood in the mid-20th century placed Black men in an ambiguous position. Namely, building a rural home and family forced men to work in towns, and yet the consequences of this separation often undermined the very institution men sought to construct. Rather than replacing traditional conceptions of manhood with ones that oppose them, as one might have expected, though, this migrancy and consequent urbanization actually contributed to the development of conceptions of masculinity that preserved the traditional idea that marriage and building a home are of central importance. This is all while urbanization was widely perceived as a corrupting process that led to increased social and moral decay, and thus placed stress on the traditional notions and arrangements. In short, masculine identity hit a period of crisis. How did men respond to the crisis they faced? Well, sociologist Catherine Campbell argues that because men were racially and economically oppressed under apartheid, the power that they held over women and young men within the family often presented the only sphere in which these men could actually assert their masculinity and practice it. And so this masculinity was a male identity that emphasized mostly economic, but also other forms of dominance. But since the economic security that was necessary to assert that kind of economic dominance was no longer available, men turned to expressing it sexually and physically. Men, especially older men, who had traditionally held the role of provider for the family and had been the key people shaping their communities through governance and decision-making, had become emasculated by a system of oppression in terms of which they were boys, literally and figuratively. Literally, white people, no matter how old or what gender they were, referred to them by the term boy, as in, come here, boy. And figuratively, they were infantilized by a set of institutional and legal arrangements that denied them opportunities and choices. They could not direct their own destinies. Their destinies were preset to poverty and subjugation. I'm sure you can see how this had huge consequences for women. Men were subjected to extraordinary violence from the apartheid state that didn't value their lives as human beings. And in turn, the only people lesser and weaker than the men, on whom the men could take out their frustration, were women and children, hence setting the stage for the widespread violence against women that occurs in South Africa today. And the ways in which men perform and try to earn their masculinity through multiple sexual conquests to become what is called isoga, which literally means a Casanova or a lady killer. The sad irony, of course, is that HIV/AIDS literally kills men and women alike, though women more than men. The ability of men to control women or to keep them in line and the use of violence to ensure this control is one area where the power of working class men has not been threatened by a racialist, in fact, racist capitalist society. So Campbell describes how male respondents in her study laid tremendous emphasis on the importance of being seen to have an obedient, faithful, and homebound girlfriend. In this context, men use violence, sometimes even fatally, in order to control women's movements and associations. They use it to force women, often their girlfriends, into sex. They also use it against men who threaten their sexual relationships. And I think on that point, it's actually really important to observe that when we're speaking of violence against women, we shouldn't forget the extensive violence that men perpetrate against other men. And this is the sort of thing that becomes multi-generational. Young men learn violence from seeing their fathers beat their mothers in order to secure their obedience. They also learn it from seeing their older brothers supposedly guarding their sisters by violent coercion. Naturally, the preservation of the status quo cannot be wholly attributed to men, though. Both men and women contribute to this kind of patriarchal normativity, right? Women can, and often do, defend prevailing notions of masculinity, or fail or even refuse to challenge it. Campbell highlights the important role played by the family in constructing a masculinity that allows the link between male identity and violence to persist and hold even a socially sanctioned place. In fact, Campbell observes that women themselves are so heavily socialized into subscribing to the existing power relations that they don't see challenging them as an option. Instead, her female respondents saw avoidance and tolerance as the only choices. None of them mentioned redefining gender relations, she says. When you connect this to the economic picture I described earlier, you come to understand, as Hunter, who I quoted earlier, correctly reports, that women's efforts to secure livelihoods in harsh socioeconomic circumstances can also serve to reproduce dominant masculinities. Through their participation in and perpetuation of male dominance, sometimes in their attempts to ensure their own material security, women contribute to making women as a group sexually and physically vulnerable. Sexually vulnerable because women do not even feel that they have the ability to ask their husbands or partners to make the behavioral changes necessary to protect them against HIV or AIDS. Reshma Satipasad describes the fact that physical violence, the threat of violence, and the fear of abandonment prevent women from negotiating condom usage or leaving relationships that are physically unsafe. For rural women especially, the risk of men returning from their city jobs to their rural wives and infecting them is very high, because these women hold the least power in their relationships and therefore usually cannot ask their husbands to use condoms. Yet HIV/AIDS is having contrary effects too. Hunter describes the reality that though society glorifies men who are successful at seducing women in a serial fashion, the brutality of HIV/AIDS, and especially the indignity with which those who have it typically die, calls the desirability of that kind of performance of masculinity into severe question, ironically, therefore, providing hope for change. Nonetheless, the 2010 census findings show that Black families continue to be worst affected by the dysfunctionality imposed by systemic oppression and the migrant labor system. Over 20% of married Black men live apart from their wives, and more than 25% of married Black women apart from their husbands. Couples in rural households are less likely to live in the same household as their urban counterparts because of the migrant labor system. I mentioned the negative effects on children earlier. Just as in the US, even when controlling for qualifications, gender and race are significant factors where salary is concerned, as white men continue to be the best paid of all. An average of about $8 an hour is earned by white men, compared to $2.20 by Black men, $2 by Black women, $5.50 by white women, Indian women $4.30, and mixed race women $2.50 per hour. Consider what all of this means, though, for Black men when they remain socially expected to be the providers for their families. And I'm referring to their extended families because the notion of families as being nuclear families continues to be not entirely embraced. And the idea of extended family continues to be the predominant notion of family that operates in South Africa. Social grants have, however, provided for caring for children, particularly poor children, and they are undoubtedly, literally a lifesaver. South Africa spends about 3.2% of its GDP on them, and it is one of the best investments the country has made. As one of our rural community-based organization partners once told me, you used to see widespread kwashiorkor around here, children looking like lollipops. You don't see that anymore. Kwashiorkor is the condition of malnutrition that hungry children develop. So thank God we've gotten rid of that. Yet, when we consider the impact that paying the social grants strictly to mothers has had on men's morale, as women now have this as a means of gaining an income, albeit a very limited one, but men don't have any means, really, one has to wonder if there is not a way to include men more and help build poor, broken families up. So I would understand if you felt a bit shell-shocked after that very grim picture I've given you of the situation of Black women and men in South Africa. But I want to remind you that, as I said earlier, this is a very narrow snapshot of South African women's experiences, given to you by someone who studies social conflict and social exclusion, and therefore focuses on the worst aspects of society. I also find it is important to remind myself regularly that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. South Africa is indeed engaged in a long-standing battle against spiritual forces of evil, taking root through human beings and wreaking havoc in the lives of millions. It is incumbent upon us to not grow weary, but continue to confront them with all that which God has gifted us in the power of his Spirit. Nonetheless, I do not want you to walk away from this talk thinking that I've given you a comprehensive view of the situation in South Africa. Indeed, this is why I want to, towards the end of my talk, play another clip for you from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which I think conveys very well what I would want you to walk away from here thinking about what I've shared.
I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, obviously, I said this in a fit of mild irritation, but it would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now, this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America.
And, of course, the same is true of South Africa, right? There aren't that many stories out there on South Africa. And so I do this more for myself, probably, than for you, to say, I'm so desperate for you not to think that this is definitive of South Africa, because it is just a single story of many, many stories. As one of my favorite books about apartheid, titled The Rediscovery of the Ordinary by Njabulo Ndebele, describes, it is important that we realize that even in the worst of times, of which, of course, colonialism and apartheid were examples, people find ways to reclaim elements of the ordinary. We should know that even in apartheid South Africa and present-day South Africa, with all of its myriad challenges, people still celebrate birthdays and get married. They have children, delight in watching their children and grandchildren grow, dream of better futures for themselves and their children, and strive for them as best they know how. In short, there are plenty of elements of the ordinary human delights that make up life, even in the lives of those living in extraordinary times and circumstances. So I guess I conclude by wanting to share a few things I think you probably wouldn't know or expect about South Africa and its women. At least there are several things you wouldn't know and expect from what I've shared with you this afternoon, and probably wouldn't know from standard media coverage of a complex country like South Africa. The first is that over 40% of South African members of parliament are female. That's more than double the rate in America, in case you didn't know. South Africa is ranked 16th out of a total of 135 economies in the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report of 2012. The United States ranks 22nd. What does that mean? Well, the report assesses countries on how well they are dividing their resources and opportunities among their male and female populations, regardless of the overall levels of these resources and opportunities. The relative rankings, therefore, reflect that with more limited resources, South Africa has made greater strides towards reducing inequality between men and women than the US. There are few things that we do better than the US, so I've got to, celebrate the things that we do. And the third thing I thought was might be interesting to share is that in the 20 years since apartheid ended, so between 1994 and 2014, South Africa's tax revenue increased tenfold. The middle-class population tripled almost. I regret that since 2000, the middle class in the US has been shrinking due to a decline in incomes and rapid growth in inequality. So even in developing countries, there are elements of development that may even surpass developed countries. If I had another hour, I could tell you the amazing things various people and organizations are doing to improve things for women and about the strides that are being made. In fact, in January, Public Radio International did a series of stories on South African women who are doing things to make things better for themselves and other women. When I lived in South Africa, I worked for a program called the Rural Women's Action Research Program, which sought to intervene on the law and policy side of these issues. And we partnered with several non-governmental organizations, such as the Rural Women's Movement of South Africa and Mdugajani Rural Development Trust, which are empowering and helping women and men in different ways to overcome the struggles in their circumstances. These organizations and many others continue their great work today. So there's really no need to despair, at least not yet. There's still plenty of cause for hope for women in South Africa. And that hope is not only in the progress we can make in the here and now, important and in fact indispensable as that is. My ultimate hope is in hope eternal. As Paul chastised the Corinthians, I exhort myself, if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are, of all people, most to be pitied. As in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. But each in turn, Christ the first fruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him. Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. Now, if there is no resurrection, why do we endanger ourselves every hour? I face death every day, Paul says. If I fought wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Come back to your senses as you ought, and stop sinning, for there are some who are ignorant of God. I say this to your shame. Some do the kind of work I'm passionate about doing only because they want to see change in the here and now. I commend those people because I think change in the here and now is incredibly important, so God bless them for taking it on. But I do this work, standing on Paul's words, that we must make every sincere effort to realize God's love, beauty, and justice for the predominantly Black, disadvantaged, and oppressed women and men in South Africa. Yet, even if, after every effort is made, we fail, eternal hope will remain. And because of that, hope that is in Christ, I will keep trying. Thank you.